Boa tarde, boa noite a todo mundo que está acompanhando hoje mais uma conversa organizada pelo Programa de Pós-Graduação em Ciências da Comunicação da UNISINOS. Especialmente hoje, 4 laboratórios de pesquisa se juntaram para uma conversa com a professora Wendy Chun. E eu vou apresentar aqui os professores que estarão com a gente hoje: o professor Gustavo Fischer, do Laboratório TCAV, o professor Ronaldo Hen, do Laboratório LIC, e a professora Adriana Amaral, do CultPop. Boa tarde a todo mundo, vocês podem mandar suas perguntas, e hoje a gente vai bater um papo com a professora Wendy Chun, que é a professora do Simon Fraser University, no Canadá, e lidera o Digital Democracies. Ela é autora dos livros Updating to Remain the Same, Programmed Visions, e acabou de lançar um novo livro na semana passada chamado Discriminating Data, Correlation, Neighborhoods and the New Politics of Recognition. E esse é o assunto do nosso papo hoje com a professora Wendy Chun. Hello, Wendy. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Great. My first question to you on your new book is that there are a high number of books, related books on critical data studies and critical algorithm studies, on data and race or data and gender. What makes your book different from this many other books on this issue?
Well, first of all, I think it's wonderful that there are so many books on this, and there should be more. And so I think that it shouldn't be, well, we have this one already, Ruha Benjamin has written it, or Kathy O'Neill has written it, so therefore we don't need any others. And I think all of our books started at the same time. About Discriminating Data started about 5 years ago. And this was a time when many of us were interested in these issues. I think that what makes my book different, or the approach that I take that is different than the others, is that rather than simply look at data, I also look at algorithmic structures and the ways in which the axioms and the assumptions built into our algorithmic structures, such as correlation, such as homophily, etc., have disturbing historical and enduring theoretical ties. So that if these algorithms are currently discriminating, it's not simply because of dirty data or of discriminatory data that is being used, but rather because of the entire philosophy and techniques of history, which is embedded in something like correlation, which presumes that if you find something that hasn't changed in the past and the present, it will stay the same in the future. And importantly, correlation was celebrated as the difference that big data makes. You know, there was all this early 21st century thing about correlation was destroying theory, was destroying the scientific method, the whole world was going to change. But this celebration of correlation eerily repeats the celebration of correlation by eugenicists in the early 20th century. And eugenicists developed correlation in order to close the future. And so I look at the ways in which the theory and philosophy of history, which is embedded within these algorithms, is partly what seems to be disruptive about these programs. And by disruptive, I mean they're disruptive not because they offer us new unforetold futures, but rather because they try to make the future repeat a certain selective past. I also, a lot of critiques of algorithms also presume that somehow if you added social sciences or the humanities to these algorithms, somehow they would be more ethical. And my point is, it's not that there's no social science or humanities in these algorithms, it's that there's bad social sciences and humanities in these algorithms. So homophily, the notion that similarity breeds connection, and this has been shown to be causing echo chambers, as well as the sort of agitated clusters of the same or rage. This is something that the Facebook whistleblowers showed, right? So when Facebook restricted your feed to people who were like you and your family, things actually got worse. Well, this notion of homophily comes from studies of US residential segregation. So it's important to understand the ways in which certain forms of sociology have become rewritten and embedded within these algorithms, and poorly so, because the original study actually said that homophily wasn't the only form of friendship, that heterophily also existed. And so trying to tease out that complicated relationship between various disciplines and the ways in which they're already speaking to each other.
Excellent.
Wendy, I have a couple of questions, and we were very fortunate to receive an advanced copy of your forthcoming book. And one of the things that we can see in the body or your body of work is what we can call a technocultural approach towards media, towards our society. And on the preface of the book, you mentioned that this is a way of not being in one of those positions, only a culturalistic approach or only a technological approach. Maybe you could share with us how this kind of approach is becoming more and more present in the social studies field, or is it still something that is very hard to approach and explain to people, especially in the academia world, and when things are so boxed within specific sciences? This is one of my questions. And also in this part of your book, you mentioned that the importance of your goal of trying to bring together engineering, computer science, humanities, social science, and arts together to take on these hard problems that we face. And my second question would be about where can we find initiatives in academia that actually can bring these areas together? Does it represent some sort of a challenge for media labs to try to be more open to this kind of view, etc.? Or maybe we have to start everything over again because we are too much into old positions regarding this discussion. Thank you.
So I'm going to start with your second question because it leads to your first really nicely. I think that the question of these interdisciplinary initiatives are really important, and they're strange. So within, especially North American academia, there's a push towards interdisciplinarity. And this push isn't always a good thing, but it's something to be negotiated and thought through. So one reason why I started doing this book and this kind of work specifically came from an initiative that was started by the new president at Brown University, where I was for almost 2 decades. So the new president comes in and she's really wonderful. And she says, I want faculty to come up with these initiatives from the ground up, and we're going to see what we're going to fund. But they put us into groups. And so I was chair of modern culture and media. I was put together with the chair of computer science and somebody who works on biostats, in particular AIDS research. And we looked at each other and we said, why are we here? And what is a problem that what's the problem we can't solve without each other? And we decided, and this came from the person in biostats, said, I can show almost any correlation to exist, so almost anything to be real, but I don't know what's true, what really matters. And then from there, we were also like, just because something's true, something's determined to be true, doesn't mean that it's going to actually provoke political action. Global climate change, for instance. And so what we started thinking through, and we called it the data inference action loop. We didn't get funded in the end. Was this really important struggle where we sat there and said, what questions do we care about? Why can't we answer on our own? And why do we need to work with each other? Because what you do is different, and because what I do is broken in certain ways. And I think what's absolutely key about interdisciplinary work is you don't go into somebody's discipline and say, look, you're doing everything wrong, or look, I know what you're doing and I'm going to take over your subject matter. But look, we care about something and I can only go so far and you can only go so far. So we need each other in order to take on these questions that we care about. And I think that's the key to interdisciplinary work. And a lot of projects are starting from the question. And if you have the question and you can see the different approaches to it, and you know where you get stuck, and we can talk to each other about where we get stuck, how can we open things up? And this, I think, is really key in terms of understanding technoculture. That media studies that's focused on cultural studies, et cetera, on content and on the screen, which has been very important, is clearly has done important work, and work that focuses, say, more on the technology, so everything but the screen, has also been important in terms of understanding the effects of media. But you don't understand what's going on unless the two meet each other. And in order for the two to meet each other, you have to think through things like infrastructure, you have to think through defaults, you have to think through assumptions. And in order to do that, we have to be open to being challenged in our fundamental beliefs. And the ways we get challenged in terms of our fundamental beliefs is when other people from other disciplines that we are working on the same topics say, I don't know why you think that. And you're forced to engage somebody else's thinking, somebody else's methodology, and just take this wonderful, wonderful opportunity to simply be curious, and to say, maybe I don't understand everything about X, but that's okay. And you don't understand everything about X, and that's okay. And I think that actually being an engineer helped me to do this, because as an engineering student, I was taught theoretically what my computer is doing. And I can tell you theoretically what my computer is doing at every level, but I can't tell you what it's actually doing at this moment. And I think being okay with and trying to understand the ways in which knowing technology leads you to understand what you can't know is crucial. And it's important that we translate this to human relations. Nobody says, I don't know your DNA. I don't know your metabolism rate. I don't know your circadian rhythm, so therefore I don't know you.
Thank you.
Adriana?
Hi, Wendy. I was thinking that in your work, and especially in this new book, you go back to the internet history and all the narrative about the dystopian origins of cyberspace, like William Gibson, and also you talk about the Californian ideology and like John Perry Barlow and all this history that connects internet with counterculture. And how do you see this legacy on the problems and critiques that we are having right now, like data and discrimination? And how do you see this erasure that this narrative sometimes have from people, from concepts? You also quote the classic Apple Macintosh 1984, the commercial TV ad. And so I would like to hear about how do you see the imaginary that was built like in the 80s and 90s about the internet, how they reflect now, because sometimes I think people also don't discuss how we got from this kind of imaginary and the historical aspects, and how do we get from that thing to now. So this is like a main discussion.
That's a great question. I would say that for me, what's key is that I don't see them as separate. I actually think the same sort of settler, colonial, frontier mentality that made us blind to so much isn't gone. And I think it actually fuels and has a lot of assumptions with where we are now, which is we've moved from frontier to gated communities. But there's still a certain settler logic that drives them both. I think that what's so key in terms of understanding some of the ways in which the internet was sold as a technology of freedom. And again, it's so weird. It's a control protocol. The internet is a control protocol. How did a control protocol get sold as a technology of freedom? Well, in part by totally ignoring the ways in which the technology operated, not simply behind it, but also in front of it. So early on, people talked, as they are now, about the metaverse. People called this cyberspace. I mean, Snow Crash, which is having such a huge influence now as all these companies try to create metaverses, it was coincident with the rise of the internet. And a lot of people back, you can think of Second Life, you can think of other ways in which people are talking about virtual reality. It's not separate from that period. It's also part of it. And so I think we need to think through the continuities of it, especially in terms of a way in which we don't even acknowledge or see what's in front of us, right? So when the internet became cyberspace, it didn't look like cyberspace. I'm old, which I'm very happy I am, which I hopefully means I get to retire sometime soon. But when we were looking at Gopher, when we were looking at the early internet, the early World Wide Web, it wasn't anything like cyberspace. The Matrix was compelling and had great visuals, not so much the World Wide Web. And yet we accepted it as cyberspace. So there's this certain willingness not to see that's so important to certain mythoses. And I think that we need to question how these mythoses get accepted. But what I think is also a lingering tradition from 1984, which was the Apple commercial, which launched the Macintosh, where the woman goes forward and smashes the screen. She's in color, and then everyone's freed. And Apple's insistence throughout about thinking different, et cetera, are the ways in which this call on us for us to be authentic, to show our difference, has actually become a way to cluster us now and make us more predictable. And what I talk about in the book, and what I find so fascinating, is how the discourse of authenticity, and importantly, within the United States, the 1996 US election wasn't simply considered to be the fake news election. It was also called the authenticity election. And the person who won scored high on both. This notion of authenticity, where you are slightly deviant, or you make your outside correspond to some inside, you reveal an open secret. And these open secrets are then used to cluster people who share the same open secret, and then move people together. How this logic of authenticity has become normalized and the norm. And how by becoming the norm and normalizing, what we have now are a clustering. Hegemony now works by taking a whole bunch of clusters around open secrets, figuring out the line between them. So one that's quite famous within the alt-right is to figure out how they all can be united as like pearls around the neck of a social justice warrior. Then you have these majorities coming out through these clusters, these agitated clusters.
Excellent, Wendy.
Thank you.
And I really like your concept of algorithmic authenticity and your history regarding reality TV until nowadays. I think it's very powerful. My question now is: you also wrote about the relations between history of slavery and history of computing, and what are the differences between eugenics and current uses of machine learning and artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so I think the question of the relationship between slavery and machines is such a large and rich one that many people have written about, from Simondon to a lot of people within Black studies, and rethinking the human, Sylvia Wynter, This is a topic that many, Ferreira as well, have been thinking through in terms of why and how does this relationship emerge. Also, those within indigenous AI studies, Making Kin with Our Machine and the Indigenous Protocol, argue that what we need in order to have a machine learning that can open the future is a different relationship to our machines. That the problem, and this is what I argue, why we view AI as an apocalypse, is precisely because of the fact that these machines and machine learning are sold to us as our servants, as our slaves. And we need to move away and against that in order to have a different relationship. Now, how correlation is different between eugenics and in the 20th century and what's happening now, there's many things that are different. And one argument I make in the book is just because you use correlation doesn't mean you're a eugenicist. Right? Correlation is important in many programs. But what correlation does is give you, based on what you've decided remains the same, and this is itself a complicated and difficult question, because what a lot of these programs or analyses take as ground truth, their data, is itself a deep fake. So within the eugenicists in the 20th century, their analyses of the poor were extremely biased. And so what they presumed was true was itself a deep fake. Deep fakes aren't something that come at the end, but also at the beginning. If you look at facial recognition technology, which is based on Hollywood celebrities, or our faces on Instagram, those are deep fakes. So one issue isn't simply that deep fakes now have become ground truth, but correlation offers you and tries to think through the most likely future given this unchanging past. And so what eugenicists tried to do was then say, okay, let's manipulate these things in order that we can shape the future in a certain way. And what links both the 20th century and 21st century analyses of correlation is this primacy and engagement with data and research, and in particular data and research, as Virginia Eubanks has shown, of the poor. But what is also different between how correlation and eugenics emerged and what was happening with eugenics then and what's happening now is also eugenics presumed that, and this is from biometric eugenicists rather than Mendelian eugenicists. So in the 20th century, there was actually a huge fight between two camps of eugenicists. One believed that everything was statistical, and what we needed was the statistical correlations. This is biometrics. And the other camp insisted, no, actually, there were genes. This is Mendelian. And the Mendelians won, but the biometricians and their notion of biometric eugenics and correlation is what's becoming dominant now within these programs. But the biometric eugenicists had the nation as the population. And the idea was, okay, we're all part of the same population pool. So in order for us to advance, because we're all interrelated, we've got to make sure certain people don't reproduce and other people reproduce. And what they offered as the kindest solution to this was segregation, to segregate out those in the population and to keep them separate. Now, what's different is, well, first of all, segregation itself is embedded within these algorithms, but through the notion of homophily, but that the goal of a lot of these, the new politics of the recognition and a lot of what's happening now isn't keeping the nation together, but rather exiting from it. So there's this notion of the sovereign individual, you'll go to Mars, et cetera, you can leave. So it's being used as ways to extract out certain communities rather than to view them as intertwined. There's also a ton more to say about this, but why don't I leave it at that?
Excellent. Thanks, Wendy.
We have a question on the chat from our streaming on YouTube. It's from Salih Kinsun. He's asking about the metaverse. Maybe you can connect that with the discussion about your topic on dystopia is the goal, not an error.
Yeah, dystopia is certainly the goal, not the error. And it's weird that we're coming back to the metaverse. And what's so fascinating about, I don't know how many of you have read Snow Crash. Yes. So for the longest time, when we taught cyberspace course, like, internet culture courses in the late 90s, the two texts you always started with were Neuromancer and Snow Crash. There was this really weird way in which the internet and fiction were so intertwined. And what's so strange about the metaverse or Snow Crash is that not only is it coming back now, right? And the metaverse describes societies that are incredibly fragmented. And the kinds of divides that we're seeing now, but it has this also overarching dream of hacking the human psyche and coming up with, the Sumerian language hack that can bring all these people together through this universal understanding, right? And it's the evil Bob Reif dude. But if you think about something like natural language processing, and this is something that Xerox Wasim, for instance, has been thinking through, that there is this dream of you find this universal thing that you can somehow hack and find, oh, sorry, the light just went off. Let me just turn back on the light. Hi, I'm in the office and we're very energy conscious. So even if I wildly gesticulate, they'll turn the lights off on me. And so I think that this sort of dream of finding this universal language that can hack the human brain. I mean, this is how people talk about social media, that they've hacked the human psyche. And the ways in which we become manipulated isn't this sort of, antenna in our brain, but rather a reduction of humans to behaviorist addicted people, right? And Snow Crash and the metaverse is all about addiction and how through addiction one can manipulate, right, either through drugs or the Sumerian hack, people so they work in certain behaviorist ways. And I think that's important, but we should also realize that that's very limited in terms of understanding humans. And we have to ask ourselves, under what circumstances do we follow behaviorist models? Because we do clearly sometimes. Those are moments in which we're highly agitated and triggered. So we become predictable the more agitated and triggered we become. And I think that having that view of human behavior, which is so reductive, is something that we need to push against by engaging the richness of human relations.
So just for people to know, Snow Crash in Brazil, it was translated under the name of Nevasca, from the book from Neil Stephenson, and I think it was released by Editora Aleph. So in case you want to know, but I don't know if they're going to do a second round now, second edition or third, I don't know, because maybe they were discussing about changing the name because, okay, it's Snow Crash, it's the name. Wendy, there is some question that we were thinking here, that is about the idea, how is the movement from pattern discrimination to pattern recognition? Also thinking that pattern recognition is a William Gibson book, since we are talking a bit about science fiction.
Yeah, so for me, pattern discrimination was, so for me, the really interesting thing is you take some of the basic mathematical functions. They were called discriminant. It was discriminant analysis. And it's really weird that at the heart of what's now become recognition technologies lie discriminant analyses. So one is just a basic historical, this was produced by R.A. Fisher to understand the difference in human skull sizes. The idea was you use linear discriminant analysis in order to take populations that were mixed and build clean walls between them, right? And what's fascinating is one of the first articles on modern facial recognition, on modern pattern recognition technology says that, well, R.A. Fisher produced the first algorithm for recognition, and it was discriminant analysis. So how did discriminant analysis and something that advertised itself as discriminating become recognized as recognition? Like what are the moves that happen there historically? And in order to understand that, I look at not only the changes within mathematical and also scientific understandings of pattern discrimination. So pattern discrimination was also emerged from experiments on mice, on punishment-averse mice, who were forced to try to see, is this shape like this shape, et cetera, and punished if they didn't figure it out. And then these became the basis for what later became pattern recognition. So what was at stake in this move from discrimination to recognition, scientifically, mathematically, and important historically and politically. And so I link this move from discrimination to recognition to the 1980s discussion of the politics of recognition and both the potential and the flaws with certain forms of multiculturalism. And the ways, more importantly now, those people who are on the reactionary right have taken up the politics of recognition as a way to deny other people their civil rights. And so for me, there's this really interesting and complicated relationship at all levels in this move from discrimination to recognition. And to understand it and to engage with it, we have to look at the mathematics, the scientific experiments, and what's happening in culture and philosophy. And if we do, we also understand, I don't know how many of you watched the Netflix docudrama, The Social Dilemma, or, a lot of the ways in which social media technology is discussed right now is blatant experimentation, that we're lab rats, we're being experimented on. But that isn't new. And it isn't new because a lot of the concepts that are embedded with them actually came from experiments on lab rats, as well as experiments on interned people and on people who lived in public housing. One thing that I'm working on now is the relationship between the rise of sentiment analysis, which is so key to social media manipulation, or to studies of Japanese American internees during World War II.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Wendy. The next question is from audience. André Lemos, professor at the Federal University of Bahia, asks, techniques are not neutral. There will always be biases, good or bad. How to ensure that algorithms will not be discriminatory, for example, if they are never neutral?
Well, I think one thing we need to realize is that we can work with the biases within technologies in order to understand and intervene into the world around us. And so for me, let me give you one classic example. This is the example of Compass, which everyone talks about. It's a software program that was actually sued within the United States of America. It's a program that determines the risk of recidivism, so how likely somebody is to be arrested again. Now, it was sued because it was shown to discriminate against racial minorities. Now, what's key is that they didn't use they didn't ask people about their race, right? So basically people filled out a survey, the inmate filled out a survey, the guard filled out a survey, or the officer, and then these were inputted in, and then Compass gave you a score, right? And what's key is that they didn't ask about questions of race, but they asked people about things which within the United States are proxies for racism, if not race. And that is educational status, employment status, age at first arrest. And the other thing that they showed played a huge role in this was dirty data. So once you were arrested and you had this data, there was a lot of typos. So just being within that group meant that things were not going to go well for you. Now, what's key is that this was introduced as a way to solve the problem of racism. It was actually introduced during the Obama era as a way to make courtrooms more fair. And the idea was racism stems from individual bias. So the way you get rid of racism is by getting rid of individual bias. But what happened is that you made things more consistent, you got rid of individual bias, but what you accentuated was institutional bias. And what Compass arguably showed is that racism is a systemic rather than an individual problem. And it showed us the ways in which this happens precisely through these proxies that matter. So my thing is we should use these programs which are operating according to the ways they're supposed to as historical probes to understand and diagnose discrimination. So in other words, I say we should treat these as global climate change models. Global climate change models show us the most likely future given the past that's fed in, not so we'll accept that future, but so we'll change it. And when global climate change models that we trust show a 2.5 degree rise in mean temperature Celsius, we seek to fix the world, not the model. And that's what we need to do with these models. See how they can open up ways in which we can fix the world. Because the relationship between these models and the world is exactly the point in which we need to intervene. And the other thing that's so important about global climate change models is that they open up the fact that there's a huge difference between being correct and being true. The point of global climate change models isn't to say, okay, this model says it's going to go up in 2 degrees in 50 years. Let's just keep going for 50 years and see if it's right. Right? That's not the point. And it's not to talk about correctness in that narrow range is to not take on that question of truth. And that's unfortunately what happens within a lot of these machine learning models, because they're validated as true, not on their ability to predict the future or to open new futures, but rather to predict the past, right? So it's not just that if society is racist and the data fed in is racist, it will make racist predictions, but it won't be validated as true unless it make racist predictions. And this is because what it predicts isn't future values, but rather past values. So values which are kept away, sort of segregated during the training phase or out of set data. And we need to think through, again, this difference between being correct and being true if we want a future.
Great. Gustavo, can you ask?
I was listening to your answer now, Wendy, and actually I took notes from the final part of your new book. You have 8 observations regarding your final topics, and one of them has the sentence, "The past is as complex as the future," and that reminded me a little bit about your 2008 text about the enduring ephemeral of the internet, which is an important article for us here at our research group in terms of understanding the ephemerality of the internet and how this makes our discussion about images and memory something very challenging and also very important to understand our current technoculture. So I was wondering if when you say that we're predicting only the past, we are predicting a past which is very much ephemeral in terms of the images that are surviving or not surviving on these terms. And then that also reminded me a little bit about on updating to remain the same. You mentioned that maybe our struggle to privacy should be shifted to the right to be exposed and how to be exposed. So these ideas, I think they kind of connect each other. I don't know if you feel the same.
Thank you for doing that for me. Yes, I completely agree, and I think that it's for me. Thank you for mentioning the enduring ephemeral, because for me it was always this weird thing about why do we think that the past simply remains? How did memory become storage, given how dynamic it is? And part of what this book is trying to understand is a more philosophical notion of history in the past as well, drawing from the work of Ariella Azoulay. But I do think they are absolutely all related. And what I find so fascinating about this notion of the enduring ephemeral, right? So if what remains is something that's constantly reproduced, and so we are always activating something in order for us to think that it is simply there. What this implies is that whenever we activate these concepts, whenever we think through correlation, whenever we think through homophily, whenever we think through sentiment analysis, we're actually reactivating those communities as well. The people within the segregated housing units, the internment camps, the mice. And so that every reactivation is also a possibility for companionship. And this is what Azoulay argues so beautifully, that this is what we call potential history. But in order to engage with potential history, we have to realize that people and things aren't sources, but rather companions. And to return to what I argued in the enduring ephemeral, there are things that we constantly repeat, and with every repetition, they seem to remain. But it's always an issue of care.
Great. Adriana, can you ask a question?
Well, I was thinking about, you talk a lot about race and gender in your new book. And I was thinking, because how do you see the intersection of these two, like classic sociological categories with all the theory that you're analyzing in the book, and how do you see we can move forward for only this? The algorithm is discriminating people. So what can we do to go further?
Yeah. So go ahead. Sorry.
And I will add, what's the role of homophily in your new book? I think this can be very powerful.
Yeah, thank you. And those are exactly how they're related. So this is fantastic. And so at the basis of social media networks is this notion of homophily, which is the notion that similarity breeds connection, that people who are alike want to be together, and they're more comfortable when they're together. And where homophily as a term emerged was through studies of US residential segregation. Studies of actually US housing projects post-World War II. And post-World War II was this really strange period within the United States. So there was this housing crisis. There was 70% of Americans supported public housing. And it was also a time public housing was mainly white. And there was this question like, what are we going to do with this housing crisis? Will there be more private loans? Will there be more public housing? We all know what happened in the United States, which is that there was a lot of private loans given to white Americans. And this is why we have this incredible income gap. One of the reasons why we have this incredible income gap within the United States that we do today. And so homophily emerged from the study, but what's so central is that these researchers were trying to study these housing projects. They had these two housing projects. One was an all-white cooperatively owned housing project, and the other one was a biracial housing project. So it was a housing project in which there were equal white and Black residents, but they didn't live in the same buildings. And in one building, they did live in the same building, only one, but they were on different floors. And so what they wanted to understand, the sociologist Lazarus and Merton, was how good were housing projects at social engineering, were they going to produce good American citizens or not? Like, what were the effects of these housing projects? And so they argued that housing projects, in order to understand their impact, you had to understand the impact of tenant morale. And one way in which they tried to understand tenant morale and also the effects of or not of social engineering was by focusing on the friends that people made, 3 closest friends people made within these projects. Because clearly, if you made new friends, then something has changed. It's an effect of social engineering. Now, how they came, so, and they started this and they said, you know, friendship's complicated, there's homophily, we don't really buy Aristotle's argument entirely that birds of a feather flock together. We also think that, and as they noted, you know, Aristotle also said that opposites attract, so there's this heterophily. Let's study these projects and try to understand when do people who are alike become friends, and when are people who are different become friends. And so they studied these projects and they found actually that homophily didn't exist in most of these projects except for 2 categories. One was gender and the other one was race. Now, in order to make the argument about race, and what they did with gender was also complicated, they said, well, if there is this separation of the 3 closest friends, regardless of where they live, if it happens that they seem to be racially segregated, it's actually due to value homophily. That values is actually what drives homophily. And to make this argument, they showed through their analysis that white liberals overselect white liberals, and white illiberals overselect white illiberals. And you were a liberal if you thought that the races got along in the biracial housing project, and you thought that the housing project should be biracial. And you were considered to be illiberal if you didn't think the project should be biracial and you thought the races didn't get along. And there was a third category, ambivalent, of people who thought the housing project shouldn't be biracial, but they thought people got along. Now, in order to make this argument, they actually threw out all the responses of the Black residents. Because they said there were too few Black residents with illiberal and ambivalent friends within the project. And they also threw out the largest category of white residents, which was ambivalence. And the actual number of white illiberals that overselected white illiberals, as they revealed in the report that was never published, was statistically not significant. And they never published the data from the study. And so part of what the book does is go back to this data. And it does so because, as they say in a footnote, there was a lot of evidence of cross-racial friendship and acquaintances. It just wasn't revealed when they looked at the 3 closest friends that people had, regardless of whether or not they lived in the project or not. And this was a very special definition of friendship that went against how sociologists were measuring friendship at that time, and goes against how friendship is now defined within social media. But what's so important is that within this study, there was so much evidence that pointed to something other than homophily. And that homophily only explains a certain type of friendship, but it doesn't even explain the phenomenon that it's supposed to. But what homophily does is it launders hate into love. Right? So how do you show you love people who are like you? You flee when other people show up. Right? So homophily becomes a synonym for racism. And what it does is it takes away institutional factors. It just becomes this sort of voluntary thing. It erases this completely. And so what's absolutely key is to understand that if we have, as we have now, this incredible issues around race and gender, think of incels, etc. It's not something new. It's the legacy of exactly taking certain concepts and certain perversions of understanding the sociological world into these algorithms and amplifying them. And so if there is this continuation of these concepts, it comes from the very structures and logics that are embedded within these algorithms.
Yes, we have a question, thanks, from Carlos D'Andrea, professor of Federal de Minas Gerais. A question: in the ongoing Facebook files scandal, for me, a key point is understanding the quantity and variety of research that is made inside that platform. These employed researchers can definitely do much more data correlation, sentimental analysis, etc., than outside researchers. How should we approach this kind of in-company database research?
Yeah, that's such a key question. I mean, there's so much research, and you can think through the EU right now, and what the European Union is doing is part of their whole data policies to say researchers have to have access to data in order to verify and legitimize certain claims, that we need to have this third party, et cetera, in order to think this through. And I'm sympathetic to this, but I also think that we need to move away from simply quantitative analyses as well, because what's so disturbing about a lot of these quantitative analyses is precisely the behaviorist models on which they're precedented, which isn't to say they don't operate, but we have to ask ourselves, what don't they capture, and what does buying into this certain logic of capture and surveillance amplify in the name of knowledge? And here, the subprime attention crisis book, I think, is fantastic at getting us to think through, the attention economy is itself a subprime mortgage market that's selling something that doesn't quite exist. And I think that the other thing that we need to understand and why this research is so important for us to have access to and think through is that if these behaviorist models work again, it's because they've created certain conditions of agitation and addiction. And so understanding that, and what was interesting about the Facebook whistleblower was that she showed homophily is actually one way in which agitation and trigger things happen. I mean, we've known this for a while. Like, people are clustered with people who are like them because it amplifies things like confirmation bias. So I think that at one point we need to think through this kind of research that's being done, which treats all humans as experimental beings, and to think through and against it, because this study of people as experimental beings comes from actually incarcerating humans and animals and putting them in situations of distress in order that they'll act in certain ways. And surely this is not something that we want.
Excellent. Thank you, Wendy. Our final questions. What are the challenges regarding devise different algorithms and modes of verification? And what's your new project, your forthcoming book, and our ongoing research in your research lab, research center?
So I think the challenge is for us to work together across disciplines to create different worlds and different methodologies. I think that this is profoundly a question of us working across and against each other, and it's crucial. So I left Brown, which I loved. It was a lovely job, to start the Digital Democracies Institute in Canada and Simon Fraser University, not just because leaving the US at that point seemed a good idea, but also that what the Digital Democracies Institute is premised on is that we need to bring together humanists, social scientists, network scientists, and data scientists to take on the hard questions that face us. We need to bring them together to take on what we consider to be roadblocks, because we need to think together. So just to offer you a description that gives you a sense of our approach, think about fake news. It's a huge topic. And the initial reaction was fact-checking. If we only had better fact-checking, this wouldn't happen. We need to show what is correct and what's incorrect. And fact-checking is important, but it's clearly not enough. And it's clearly not enough because, fact-checking, it's a small amount of fact-checking versus a huge disinformation network. Also, some people, fact-checking can actually spread the story to people who haven't heard it before. And also because people, sometimes they don't care if something is correct or incorrect. They're spreading it because they find it to be funny or to be true or authentic in a different way. And importantly, people read fiction all the time. Again, think back to our conversation of Gibson and Stevenson. People read this fiction and it felt true to them and it had all these impacts. And that's what's so important. So what we're trying to understand is why and how people find things to be authentic or true, irregardless of facticity. And in order to understand that, you have to engage with literature, with theater and performance studies, with media studies. What we're living is arguably one big soap opera. And in addition to quantitative analyses that look at the difference or not between factually correct and authentic or seemingly authentic pieces of information, in order to make the intervention at the level of authenticity and larger questions of truth.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Wendy, for having us in Brazil in our YouTube channel here. Thank you, Gustavo and Adriana. Please read, people read Discriminating Data book. And thank you for your audience too. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
for your excellent questions. This was really wonderful.
Oh, great.